So you may be wondering, dude, what the heck? This is a TRS-80. It's a Model 4D. The D stands for Decimate, which is the software that came with it, but it's essentially a Model 4. It has two disk drives. They're TEC FB503 drives. They're double-sided, double density, 360K, 40-track drives. And that was a big deal back in the day because it gave you, more storage space than the single-sided, single-density drives. So anyways, this system came equipped when it was sold with 64K. So why do I have this thing apart? Well, the reason I have this thing apart is we're going to do the same thing we did with the IBM, and I'll leave a link for this because I'm not going to repeat some of the things that we did with it. But I'm going to be attaching a Gotek device on it to emulate the floppy. So that way I can boot up with different operating systems and store a ton of files on here. So that way I can eliminate the need for floppies. And I can also bring down images from the internet and all sorts of stuff. Like I said, I'll leave you the link on how to make this. I've already done it once already for the IBM. I'm just basically doing the same thing. The only difference here is that the jumper settings for the TRS-80, I set it for S0, which is drive 0. You can also set it for drive 1, and I'll explain why that's important later. And I took out the JC jumper. I don't use the flash floppy because I have flash floppy loaded on this. I don't use the flash floppy configuration file at all. So, I installed the rotary switch and all that stuff to allow me to deal with pretty much anything that's in the configuration file. So I don't have a configuration file loaded, which is a good thing because it's sometimes confusing. So that's what we're going to do here. But I found some little surprises. So I already have it apart. Why? Because I didn't want to burden you with me taking out, there's about 5 or 6 screws on the bottom, and then there's one screw on the top back. The case coming out, let me just give you some advance warning. So when you pop the case out, there's a couple of videos that already explain this because I did a lot of due diligence before doing this, but there's a gap as you're taking the case off between the top floppy and the case that allows you to see through to the back. Now the back has the wires that are really nicely zip tied down, so I didn't have an issue that you're looking for, but some of these wires aren't tied down. And that tube, the CRT tube in the back, comes really close to that. So you want to look through here and make sure that you're moving the case to clear those wires. Because if that tube snags on those wires and you just take that top off, it's going to crack and you're going to be in a world of hurt. Because these CRTs aren't exactly, on the store shelves. So that's first thing, is take a look as you're taking this case out and be careful that the back of the tube doesn't snag the wiring. Underneath is where all the screws are, and there's 3 screws on the bottom and the front, there's a couple on the side, there's some on the back, and then there's one on the back top, okay? So the drive, I already took the screws out as well, but here's the cool thing about the drive. Let me take the camera off here so you can see, because I'm gonna also show you a really cool thing that I found with this computer that I didn't expect. So the drive, there's 2 screws on this side. There are 2 Phillips screws that hold it in, and you would think, oh, dude, the circuit board, the power supply is in the way of the 4th screw because there's, a screw hole here. But infinite wisdom, they only use 3 screws to hold the drive in the bay. There is no screw behind the power supply. So you only need to take off 3 screws for the drive to come out. And I've already done the screws. Let me see if I have undone the power and take out the floppy cable. Okay. So this should slide right out. Boom. There we go. Easy peasy. That's the way they made things back in the day. These drives here, like I said, I think these are FB503s. Yeah, they're TEC. Let me see. Where's the focus on this guy? Yeah, the TEC FB503s, double-sided, double density, 360K, 40 track drives. So the drives have a jumper on the back. That jumper right here is set for device 0, which is drive 0. The second jump, if you push it over to the left one, that makes it drive 2 or drive 1. So it's drive 0 and drive 1. So this is drive 1, which means the one that's already here on the top is set for drive 2. So that means that disks boot off of this guy. So here's the cool thing, and that's going to be important later on when I show you what the deal is with the Gotek. But I just want to show you something that's really awesome with this TRS-80. This was a surprise to me, surprise obviously to the seller as well, because they didn't mention this, and I'm sure they didn't open this computer up. So this computer comes standard with 64K. Okay. So the nice thing about this computer though, I want to show you what's in the back, because that's the cool part of this thing. This thing says 64K, but it came, I don't know if I can count, there we go. It came with 128K. So there's 64 in addition, an additional 64K that was already loaded. But that's not even the best part. There's this. What this add-on board here is a high-res graphics board. It didn't come standard with this. This is aftermarket, but it's vintage period correct. What that does is there's software that's made for this that, well, let me explain. So the Model 3, which is the computer, its predecessor, had a resolution of, I think it was 64 by 16, you know, the big font resolution. This, when this came out, the resolution on this is 80 by 24, so it's a lot nicer, and you'll be able to see that when I boot it up. But that high-res graphics board allows you to push, and this is a green screen, mind you, but it allows you to push the resolution to 640 by 240, or 512 by 190 or 192, whatever it may be. But bottom line is, you're going from 80 by 24 to 640 by 240. Huge, especially if you're doing like Mandelbrot's and you know, math equation graphics, and you know, there's some other high-ref graphic programs that were programmed just for that. So that is the cool part about the high-res graphics board. That was quite the add-on back in the day. The other thing is with the 128, here's the thing. You can load up Montezuma's CPM, for example, on here, and what it'll do is it will free up the bottom bank of 64K, and that's where all where your native programs typically run. But what you can do with that, since you have 128K, is you can load a program up on the top bank of 64K and leave it there, and load another program up on the bottom bank of 64K, and you can actually switch between the two, which is taken for granted now with Windows, because you can, you know, have multiple threads running and multiple windows open and all that stuff. But back then in 1985 or 88, whenever this came to be, that was nonsense. You know, that was huge. So anyways, you know, like I said, the initial bank of here is 64K, but you can always use the extra, you know, 64 for RAM, for disk caching, for, you know, who knows what. But the beauty of this whole thing is I expected to receive a TRS-80 64K. And I also didn't realize that they had double density drives, because the Model 3 had single density drives. So to find that this had 128K plus that high-res graphics board was, you know, almost like finding a little bit of hidden treasure. So anyways, so let's get to this. Okay, so let me show you what we've got here, because I worked on this a little bit off camera. So the Gotek here, see if I can zoom in a little bit. I put a switch just above the USB port, and what that switch does, it's a double pull, double throw switch. And so on one side, the middle goes to ground, okay, on the plugs here. Each side, one goes to S0 and one goes to S1. So if I flick the switch to the right, let's say, it's going to short the ground with S0. If I switch it to the left, it's going to short the ground to S1. So when you flick the switch to the right, these two pins on the left get shorted. When you switch to the left, these two pins on the right get shorted. So those are the ones. The one in the middle is the common between the two shorts, and that's ground. So the left shorts S1 to ground, and the right shorts S0 to ground. Now the bottom ones go to the top drive, and it's the exact same thing except in reverse. If this one is shorting S1, that means the bottom two short S0 or device 0 on the top drive. So it's the reverse. So that way when you flick this switch to the right, this goes to S0 and the top goes to S1. When you flick it to the left, this goes to S1 and the top goes to S0. So that's what that switch is for. Everything else, I already have a video, I'll link you to it, of what I did with the Gotek, putting in the select switch. I also put in a little speaker so I know when the drive is working. The only other thing I had to do here, I tapped into the Molex in the computer. Okay, so the left two are 5 volts, and I put a plug in here, and that's going to go into the Gotek. And then the only other thing I had to do is I found, so I have this floppy to 34 pin adapter, which I got on eBay. The problem was that the ribbon cable from the back of the TRS-80 here wasn't long enough to reach the Gotek, because the Gotek is sitting in the middle. So I had to make this cable. It's basically an extension cable for a 34 pin. So there's the female on this side and there's the male on this side. So I just needed to put an extension, a 34 pin extension between the Gotek and this. And this. So that extension gives me the clearance that I need in the cabling to get to the back. Okay? So that's all there is to it. So let's go ahead and hook this thing up. And see if this thing works. Okay. So we're going to slide this in. We won't screw it in just yet, because obviously we want to make sure that this works. So we'll just leave it like that for now. And I got to clear the wires. Okay, so we're ready to turn this thing on and see what happens. Keep your fingers crossed. Though it's not rocket science, so I can't imagine it's going to be any kind of drama here. Okay. Pull this camera out because I forgot I got the monitor sitting on its side. So I'm going to tilt the camera this way so you can see what's happening. But this right now I believe is on S0. So we should hear the drive whirring. We're going to plug this thing in. Okay. I'm going to turn it on. Gotek should come on, and it should be, you can hear the clicking sound from the speaker, the piezo speaker that I got in there. Okay, so that is loading off the Gotek. So now I should see the top light go on if I turn this way. That makes this drive 0 and this drive 1, so it should boot up off of this one. And the Gotek has LDOS 6.3 in it. That's what the screen shows, LDOS 6.3. So you know I'm not going to be pulling your leg. This top disk here is LDOS 5.3. So, okay, so let's just hit reset, and I should see the top drive loading LDOS. So you can see it going. Okay, and there you go. LDOS 5.3. So that's the top drive booting up. So I should be able to now do a dir, and this should show me the directory from the bottom. Yeah, this way. This should show me the directory from the bottom, from the Gotek. There you go. So now I can boot up either off a floppy or I can boot up off the Gotek. And why do I need to do that? Well, the reason I need to do that is because if I boot up off the Gotek and then I go to an image on the Gotek that doesn't have the system files in there, and I boot it up off the Gotek as device 0, it's going to give me a disk error. So, you know, I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to boot up off the Gotek. Okay, I'll put in a date here. Okay, so now this is doing a directory on the Gotek. Okay, and I'm going to go to an image here that doesn't have, there, it's an empty. So I'll explain why I created an empty disk image here. So now if I do a directory on the Gotek, this drive 0, you see? Because there's no system files on there. Unlike the IBM that holds it in memory, this goes to the disk every single time. The reason I have an empty images here with no system is I have created an empty image. I will format it with the system files, and then I will go and take the stick and put it in my IBM PC, and I will copy that image. So that way I will have an abundance of open 306, or actually I think I made the 720K disks in here for me to start loading data onto. So I'm basically creating systems on all of my on one empty disk here, one empty disk image, and then copying that on the stick over and over and over to create multiple images that have the system files on them. The other thing is that I may not want to load 6.3, I may want to load 5.3, or I may want to load different OS, I may want to load CPM. So now, what'll happen if I switch this over? Okay, so now this is drive 1, and that's drive 0. Well, I already booted off of it as drive 0, and now I switched it over in the middle without restarting anything. And it's now drive 1, right? So this is what'll happen. It loaded the system off of the top drive, which is now drive 0. That's what it's doing right now. It's loading the system off drive 0. And it restarted DOS primarily because switching this in the middle with drive 0 and drive 1 is sketchy. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but you're not damaging anything. But the thing is that it's not foolproof. You know, now if I hit the reset button, it will boot up 0 and everything will be just normal again, and the Gotek will be drive 1. And then I can do a directory off of it. So there's some nuances. You don't want to really, you know, like I said, it's sketchy flicking the Gotek from 0 to 1 or swapping the drives from 0 to 1 after it's booted up. But nonetheless, the cool thing is I got what I wanted. Is I'm now able to either boot up off the Gotek or off the top drive and load anything I want between either one of the two. I could even copy disks from the top drive down to the Gotek into the empty images, or I can do the reverse. So that was the whole thing of this. Also letting me load different operating systems without having to have a disk. And then I don't have a hard drive, so basically I'm using the Gotek as, you know, a whole bunch of floppy images on the Gotek to move files around. So cheap man's way of doing it, if you didn't want to go and spend a ton of money on the Fred device for this, the Gotek is all of $25, and all the extra stuff on it, maybe another $5. So, all right, so I'm going to put this thing back together, and we'll do another real quick demo once it's all back in one piece. All right, so stay tuned. Okay, one thing I wanted to point out when you're putting the case back, there's nothing that makes me more, nothing that makes me more nervous than that, hitting that. Notice here, I took off the screws to these to push back, because when I was putting the case on, these things just didn't have enough, it didn't have enough clearance. They stuck out too much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to slide the case on, not lay it down all the way, but just enough to clear these things, and then I'll reach in my hand above this and just reach in there and hold them down while I screw them tight again. So be cognizant of that. It may not have been the best place to put these switches. I don't know, we'll see, but I'm going to give that a shot and see where that takes me. All right, so I finally got the case back on this thing, and you know, like I say in all these videos, I hope you learned something from my mistakes, and I made a couple mistakes here, just so you're aware if you're going to do this. First of all, sliding the case back on, there's very little clearance between the face plates of the drives and the case. So I have a switch here that sticks out, and I have this selection knob that sticks out. And that presented a bit of a problem because I couldn't fit the case on. So I had to put actually the case, I had to unscrew the switches and the selection knob and push them back. And then I had to slide the case on. Then I had to lift the case up, and I propped it by 2 little blocks on each side. I lifted the case up a couple of inches so I can have air gap between the case and the faceplate. And I reached my hand in there and I held the switches in place while I tightened the switch in the front and I tightened the selection knob in the front. So I pushed them back through with my hand and tightened them down. That's how I got the case back on. If I had to do it over again, I probably wouldn't have the rotary selection potentiometer switch, whatever you want to call it. I wouldn't have had the rotary dial. I would have just not used it and used the 2 push buttons on the Gotek in front. Now, it's a pain in the butt to use those when you have a whole lot of images, but nonetheless, it obviously wouldn't have, you know, detrimented me putting the case back on nice and smoothly. I also wouldn't have used this toggle switch. I would have used instead a sliding switch. That way it's low profile with the faceplate, and the case would have just slid in all nice and easy. So that's a lesson learned. If I had to do it over again, I'd take out the selection knob and I would use a sliding switch or a low profile switch for selecting drive 0 and 1. So that being said, let's boot this thing up and make sure that I didn't take off any wires when I was putting this back together again. So this is set for drive 0. You can see how fast it loads off the Gotek. You know, let me do this one more time and reset it. The Gotek is drive 0 right now. Look how fast it loads, because we're going to compare it to how fast it loads from the top. Boom. That was quick. So now let's put this on drive 1 That's the Gotek, and so the top is going to be drive 0. So it should be booting up TRS-DOS from drive 0, because that's the disk I have in there. Okay. So I don't know if you can notice, but it is a lot faster loading from the Gotek. You know, obviously there's no mechanical elements involved. So you can see it takes a little bit longer. So I loaded off of here. I should be able to do a directory on drive 1, and that should show me the Gotek files. Notice it's loading the system files from the top, and then it does a directory from the bottom. That's why I did this, because with the Gotek, if I booted from the Gotek as drive 0, and then I switched over to a data image that didn't have the OS on it, it would hunt for the OS somewhere. It needs to be somewhere. So I can't have obviously boot up from this and then go to an image without the OS on this and do a directory on it. It's not going to find the OS. So I have to have that drive. So I wanted the flexibility of being able to boot up different OS systems by having this as drive 0. Okay. But I also wanted the ability to load data files, basic files, things like that from here without having to have the system on each image. So the other thing that I did is here, using the HXC software on the Gotek, I put in an image that's a blank disk. I believe it's a 720K disk that I used. I'll have to go back and check. If not, it's a 360, but nonetheless, it's 40 tracks, double density, double-sided. I created a clean HFE file. It's basically an empty diskette. So then what I plan to do is just copy or back up an OS disk onto that empty image. And then I can take that back, take the stick off, put it on the PC, and I can copy that over and over and over. So now I have a whole bunch of disk images on the Gotek that are bootstrapped, so to speak, that have the system on them. So this way I can copy files on it and not have to worry about having an OS disk, on the floppy drive anytime I use any of those images on the Gotek. So hopefully you understood all that rambling. But bottom line is, this obviously works. I'm super happy with it. Loading up off the Gotek and doing a directory on drive 1 should now do a directory on this. You should see that floppy going. Okay, so I got what I wanted out of this. Hopefully you learned something from my mistakes as usual. I mean, that's why I do these live. I don't go back and edit things out that I've done wrong or that have gone south. I think the best way to share with everybody are the things that went wrong so others don't do the same things. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment. But like I always say, enjoy, play around, and do what makes you happy, man, because, you only live once, right? Take care.